Chapter 6, Testing for What? PCR is just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what it is. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really is gonna hurt you. Kary Mullis, inventor of polymerase chain reaction, PCR, won. This is, in my opinion, the most important chapter in this book. In it we will discuss the basis of the entire COVID era, mass, ubiquitous testing. In order to do this, we will begin with the gold standard test, the PCR, and work our way down to other tests which were also used despite having massive faults. There are several glaring issues with PCR which, when taken together, disqualify it as a meaningful method of diagnosing cases. Despite these issues, it was used anyway as the primary tool used to allege a pandemic and to justify all the damage which precedes and follows this chapter. The inventor's disdain for the public health officials in question and their perversion of his method, as can be seen in the preceding quote. Kary Mullis is the inventor of the PCR process. The process itself is a thermal cycling method used to make up to billions of copies of a specific DNA sample, making it large enough to study. 2. With uses in a variety of fields from biomedical research to criminal forensics, PCR has been considered a discovery for the ages, earning Mullis a Nobel Prize in 1993. Unfortunately, however, even the most genius of inventions can be subject to misuse. And despite Mullis' death in August 2019, just prior to the first declarations of a pandemic, he was well versed and outspoken on the abuses of his method by those he deemed unfit to use it. 3,4. These guys like Fauci get up there and start talking and, he doesn't really know anything about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and put it under an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus under there you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and he should not be in a position like he's in. Most of those guys up there are just total administrative people, and they don't know anything about what's going on in the body. Mullis' experience with figureheads like Fauci came during what has turned out to be a very similar situation to today, namely, HIV/AIDS. In other interviews too, he had described his revelations about the weak foundations related to that declared pandemic. 5. For example, Mullis recalled being unable to find a single person or study demonstrating conclusively that HIV truly was the cause of AIDS. According to Mullis, even Luc Montagnier, the person who is credited with discovering HIV, did not have more than a completely unrelated study on monkeys to point him to. As we will demonstrate later, the entire history of public health declared pandemics in general is extremely relevant to what we face today and is necessary background to understand what is happening in context. However, the reasons we must now call attention to Mullis' spat with these institutions during AIDS are as follows: to identify the players and to observe that their ideology is the same now as then. To further demonstrate the stark contrast and observable conflict between those who practice the scientific method, Mullis, Malone, etc., and those who make claims in the name of science, Fauci, Walensky, etc. And, most importantly in the case of this section, to show conclusively that even though Mullis is not here to object openly to the current abuse of his method, there was clear precedent for the conflict which already existed surrounding it. Indeed, Mullis was well aware of the strengths and weaknesses of his method. One key weakness, as it relates to the use of PCR for the detection of infectious disease, is called out in the following quote by the inventor himself: "And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody, my emphasis. It starts making you believe in the, sort of, Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else. Right? I mean, if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of in your body, my emphasis, okay. So that can be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. Focusing on the bolded parts of the above quote, what Mullis is explaining is that PCR is not a method for demonstrating the quantification of a substance in the body. It can take the substance and make copies for improved observation, but it cannot tell you how much of the thing being observed is actually inside you or what impact it's having on you, if any. The reason this is so relevant in the case of viral illness is that the quantity of viral replication in the body is, theoretically, the thing that determines whether or not you actually become ill. The prevailing theory, germ theory, behind why some viruses ultimately make people sick is that they take over our cells and force those cells to replicate the virus. 6. At the same time, the human body is constantly filled with and exposed to millions of viruses. Fun fact, there are as many as 10 million viruses in a single drop of ocean water. 7. Under normal circumstances, the immune system is able to account for the vast majority of viruses, and so this replication is prevented. However, as you can now imagine, it would not be useful under those normal circumstances for you to simply know whether or not a virus is present. You would only become sick when a virus your immune system fails to fight off is sufficiently replicating, which PCR cannot tell you whether that is or isn't the case. And thanks to the weapon PCR has been made into by ignoring the importance of quantification, people have become conditioned during the COVID pandemic, for the first time in germ theory history, to fear asymptomatic carriers. In all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks. The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person. Anthony Fauci, January 20208. However, only patients with signs and symptoms consistent with pertussis should be tested by PCR to confirm diagnosis. Testing asymptomatic persons should be avoided as it increases the likelihood of obtaining falsely positive results. Asymptomatic close contacts of confirmed cases should not be tested, and testing of contacts should not be used for post-exposure prophylaxis decisions. Pre-COVID statement from the CDC: 9 As the positivity rate for SARS-CoV-2 decreases, the positive predictive value also decreases. This means that the probability that a person who has a positive result, SARS-CoV-2 detected, is truly infected with SARS-CoV-2 decreases as positivity rate decreases, irrespective of the assay specificity. Therefore, healthcare providers are encouraged to take into consideration testing results along with clinical signs and symptoms, confirmed status of any contacts, etc. Deleted but archived statement from the WHO. 10 As we can see, both the WHO and CDC acknowledged the obvious at one point. An important, additional question one might ask about asymptomatic carriers, however, is as follows: if SARS-CoV-2 is novel, meaning no one would inherently possess immunity to it, and is also the cause of the disease referred to as COVID, then how can anyone have been an asymptomatic carrier of it? The answer is that they obviously can't have been, and this implies one of two things: SARS-CoV-2 is not novel and is therefore not the cause of the novel disease referred to as COVID. SARS-CoV-2 is novel and is the cause of the novel disease called COVID. This, however, must imply that the PCR tests do not work to a dramatic extent, since the idea of asymptomatic infections with a novel virus is impossible if the germ theory is true. The implications of either possibility are obvious, and the damage caused by public health's ignorance of these logical determinations is extraordinary. Unfortunately, however, the reality of the situation is even worse. The official PCR test calibration used worldwide was riddled with flaws. The conflict between disinterested scientists and the czars of public health has not died out today. Despite Mullis' death, the torch has simply been taken up by a new, large swath of those who also practice the scientific method. And this brings us to our next issue as it relates to PCR in the COVID era. On November 27, 2020, a group of 22 scientists submitted an extensive external peer review report to the Eurosurveillance editorial board. 11 These scientists came together with a broad range of expertise including pharmacology, genetics, engineering, molecular andrology, biochemistry, microbiology, cardiology, infectious disease, and immunology. In their report, they acknowledge that the methodology used to calibrate the PCR test came from a January 2020 report most famously attributed to Christian Drosten called, Detection of 2019 Novel Coronavirus, 2019, nCoV, by real-time RT-PCR. 12 The Corman-Drosten methodology was ultimately accepted by the WHO, and therefore, thanks to the centralization we've discussed before, became an accepted basis for testing globally. So the importance of this one publication cannot be overstated. It was directly responsible for the consequences of actions taken by societies worldwide. The thesis of the external peer review report, however, is that there are a variety of major scientific flaws at the molecular and methodological level with the Corman-Drosten PCR calibration. According to the authors, these flaws lead to misdiagnosis and significant false positive rates. As such, the recommendation of the scientists involved is a retraction of the Corman-Drosten paper by the Eurosurveillance board. The specific, egregious flaws they called out were as follows. The scientists conclude that neither of the two stated aims, i.e. development and deployment of a robust diagnostic methodology, were possible, since the tests were developed without any actual virus material from external peer review report. The novel coronavirus is based on in silico, theoretical, sequences, supplied by a laboratory in China, because at the time neither control material of infectious, live, or inactivated SARS-CoV-2 nor isolated genomic RNA of the virus was available to the authors. To date, no validation has been performed by the authorship based on isolated SARS-CoV-2 viruses or full-length RNA thereof. A quote cited from the Corman-Drosten report, "We aim to develop and deploy robust diagnostic methodology for use in public health laboratory setting without having virus material available." Before we continue to the remainder of the flaws, I'd like to just reiterate how astonishing this point really is. In the words of the calibrators themselves, the PCR test for SARS-CoV-2 was developed, without having virus material available. Please remember, this test was considered the gold standard during the 2 primary years of the COVID era. Without virus material available, it is obviously impossible for the test to have been accurate. However, another extremely important point is when the external peer reviewers mention, no validation has been performed by the authorship based on isolated SARS-CoV-2 or full-length RNA thereof. If SARS-CoV-2 has been isolated and its entire genome sequenced, which is up for debate as we will come to discuss, it would seem a very logical next step to scrap and slash or revise the Corman-Drosten report based on this new information. The fact that this never happened is unfathomable to the point of warranting criminal investigation. As someone with computer modeling experience myself, I can attest that it is impossible, not unlikely, impossible for an actually identified sequence to exactly match a sequence generated theoretically, using computer modeling. An exact match would be a miracle of indescribable proportions, and that miracle is what would have needed to have happened for the tests developed on the Corman-Drosten standards to have been accurate. The number of amplification cycles originally recommended by the WHO via the Corman-Drosten report and used by most laboratories in the US and Europe were set far too high, leading to false positive rates of at least 97%. They should have been set no higher than 25 to 30 cycles. From external peer review, in the case of virus detection, 35 cycles only detects signals which do not correlate with infectious virus as determined by isolation in cell culture. If someone is tested by PCR as positive when a threshold of 35 cycles or higher is used, as is the case in most laboratories in Europe and the US, the probability that said person is actually infected is less than 3%, the probability that said result is false positive is 97%. My emphasis, this point is further supported by a 2020 study by Jaffer et al. In Clinical Infectious Diseases titled, Correlation between 3790 qPCR positive samples and positive cell cultures including 1941 SARS-CoV-2, which found that more than 97% of PCR positives were not actually infectious in a cell culture at 35 cycles, and more than 80% at 30 cycles. 13. This study showed it took lowering the CT rate to 25 cycles in order to get even 70% of PCR positives to be infectious in a cell culture, still a 30% false positive rate. And those findings are not even disputed by Anthony Fauci either, who has admitted that, if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. You almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle, even 36, it's just dead nucleoids, period. 14. If this is true, then how can Fauci not be completely furious and at odds with the FDA and CDC, which, in a document titled, CDC 2019, Novel Coronavirus, 2019, nCoV, Real, Time RT, PCR Diagnostic Panel, declare, a specimen is considered positive for 2019, nCoV virus if all 2019, nCoV marker, N1, N2, cycle threshold growth curves cross the threshold line within 40.00 cycles, 40.00 CT. 15. Again, we find ourselves at another astonishing point which needs to be addressed. Anthony Fauci, the figurehead of the COVID era, declared the cycle threshold rates mandated by the FDA and CDC meaningless, yet has not in any way called out those organizations for the obvious scientific fraud that implies. It must be wondered by any reasonable person why this is the case. And whether the answer is fraud or incompetence is irrelevant when it comes to the damage done by errors as egregious as the at least 97% false positive rates identified by the external peer reviewers. But despite our gracious refrain from assuming it, the case for intentional fraud is bolstered by the subsequent actions of these organizations in 2021. One example is the WHO reducing its recommended cycle threshold rate on the US inauguration day, just as the COVID mass inoculation program it supported was beginning. 16. Another is the CDC's deleted, after, pushback spring 2021 notice to reduce PCR cycle threshold rates to 28 in a report about inoculation, breakthrough cases. 17. The changing of the methodology used to determine COVID case rates in any way in 2021 without acknowledging the obvious impact this would have had on the 2020 rates, 97% reduction, is a clear, undeniable fraud. For it to align with the mass inoculation campaign suggests it was intentional, but more on that later. Even the New York Times acknowledged this cycle threshold scandal in their article titled, "Your coronavirus test is positive. Maybe it shouldn't be." 18. The article admits, most tests set the limit at 40 cycles. A few at 37. A judge in Portugal also officially ruled any PCR tests greater than 25 cycles to be totally unreliable, and therefore determined lockdowns to be unlawful. 19. And to further reveal the absurdity of these issues, one need look no further than Tanzania, where a goat and a pawpaw fruit tested positive for COVID-19.20 additional issues which disqualify the test as a diagnostic tool. Extremely high concentrations of primers leading to non-specific bindings. 6. Unspecified wobbly positions leading to enormous variability in the real-world laboratory implementations of the test. Temperature setting issues. Lack of product validation at the molecular level. Lack of positive control to evaluate SARS-CoV-2 specificity or negative control to exclude other coronaviruses. My emphasis, lack of standardization in test design. The test cannot discriminate between the whole virus. and viral fragments. Points 3e and 4 are more crucial details about the PCR protocol that bear repeating. The Corman-Drossen PCR protocol accepted by the WHO and used to establish the pandemic does not test for the novel coronavirus. It does not differentiate between specific SARS viruses and also does not test for whole virus at all, but rather for genetic material that is claimed to make up a fragment of the virus. This, however, is still not even a believable premise, considering the virus the Corman-Drossen report is based on was determined theoretically by a Chinese laboratory, as we've discussed previously. The Corman-Drossen report was not otherwise peer-reviewed despite the magnitude of its importance and the fact that peer review is a common, necessary practice. Version 1.0 of the protocol was published at the official WHO website on January 13, 2020, which was updated to version 2.1 on January 17, 2020. This version was then submitted to Eurosurveillance on January 21, 2020, accepted for publication on January 22, 2020, and published on January 23, 2020. In the opinion of the external peer reviewers, the Corman-Drossen report was therefore not, at the time, peer-reviewed, and would not have been considered worthy of publishing if it had been. Significant conflicts of interest. Two of the authors of the Corman-Drossen paper, Christian Drosten and Chantal Rieskin, are also members of the editorial board of Eurosurveillance. This severe conflict of interest strengthens suspicions the paper was not peer-reviewed and further compromises its scientific integrity. Both Victor Corman and Christian Drosten also failed to mention their additional affiliation with the commercial test laboratory, Labor Berlin, where they are responsible for virus diagnostics related to real-time PCR testing. This is extremely troubling when considering Drossen's position on the editorial board of Eurosurveillance. Two separate contributors' conflicts of interest were added in July 2020 which were not included in the original published version of the report and include conflicts with TIB, Malbile I, company to produce PCR kits based on the protocol published in the Corman-Drossen report. In summary, this is a scandal of epic proportions on which the entire alleged pandemic was based. While I focus on Fauci's words in this book because I am American, Christian Drosten of Germany should receive an equal amount of scrutiny for the way his dishonest behavior mirrors Fauci's. The following excerpt from a Wirtschaftswoche interview Drosten did in 2014 is particularly telling as far as his culpability goes. 21. Yes, but the method PCR is so sensitive that it can detect a single genetic molecule of this virus. For example, if such a pathogen scurries across the nasal mucosa of a nurse for a day without her becoming ill or noticing anything else, then she is suddenly an MERS case. Where previously terminally ill people were reported, mild cases and people who are actually perfectly healthy are now suddenly included in the reporting statistics. This could also explain the explosion in the number of cases in Saudi Arabia. On top of that, the local media made the matter unbelievably high. There is hardly any other topic in the TV news or daily newspapers in the region. And doctors in hospitals are also consumers of this news. They then also consider that they should keep an eye on this disease, which has also been very rare in Saudi Arabia up to now. Medicine is not free of fads. I fear that the current increase in MERS cases/deaths is more due to the increased attention. It's no different in this country. If Bild or the Evening News reports about an outbreak of a certain virus, the number of laboratory tests increases significantly. Simply because doctors are then also sensitized and look out specifically for the pathogens that are being reported on. It would be very helpful if the authorities in Saudi Arabia would go back to using the previous definitions of the disease. Because what interests us first are the real cases. I think it is questionable whether hospital staff who are asymptomatic or mildly infected are really virus carriers. Even more questionable is whether they can pass the virus on to others. The advisory team of the new health minister should distinguish more clearly between medically necessary diagnostics and scientific interest. Christian Drawson knew in 2014 that PCR tests would be over-sensitive. Christian Drawson knew in 2014 that such testing would lead to the false diagnosis of asymptomatic people, who he knew would not be infectious. Christian Drawson knew that the explosion of testing would lead to a vicious cycle of media hype. Christian Drawson knew that doctors would follow the hype of the fad, and would be sensitized enough by it to encourage testing. Christian Drawson knew none of this was helpful to public health. In 2020, Christian Drawson developed a PCR test anyway based on a theoretical virus and set the cycle threshold rate such that it would be excessively sensitive. In the report in which he developed this test, he failed to disclose a conflict of interest with a commercial test laboratory responsible for diagnostics. There is perhaps no one in the entire world outside of Anthony Fauci himself with the type of means, motive, and opportunity that Christian Drawson had as far as knowing how a pandemic could be manufactured and how to profit from it. We will cover much more on Drawson later, but the 180-degree heel turn he made in the COVID era to hysterical endorsement of mass testing paints an ugly picture about who this man is.